In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So today we have as a gospel the story of the feeding of the 5,000, this time from the Gospel according to John, which occurs at the beginning of the 6th chapter of John. You see that in your bulletin. I remember many years ago being warned by our preaching professor, Bill Hethcock, in seminary. He said, watch out for July and August in year B. He said, don't say everything you want to say about bread the first Sunday because it goes on for an entire month. We're going to be in chapter 6 of John for a month. So I don't want to say everything I know about bread right now. But I do want to talk about this. It's a well-known parable. And usually when we hear the story of how these 5,000 men, not counting women and boys, probably more than 5,000 people, showed up because of Jesus' preaching, and especially, as John says, his healing, that he was caring for and healing the people, and they came out in huge numbers. And here they are in the middle of nowhere, and it's time for them to eat. And in one way or another, in all of the four Gospels, we have this story of there's a boy there and he's got 5 barley loaves, which are just everyday bread, not big, 2 fish, everyday food. And somehow, Jesus will make it enough for all 5,000 men and all the women and children and everyone else who was there. Most of the time when we hear this story, we start thinking about how did he pull this off to feed so many people with so little food? And when we do that, sometimes I think we overlook something else. So here's the something else. 2 weeks ago, we had the story of the death of John the Baptist. His death took place in the context of a grand banquet being thrown by King, actually Tetrarch Herod Antipas. And all the great and powerful people of Galilee and Perea were there for this grand banquet that the king was throwing. And you can just imagine the wine was flowing freely, and there was lots of delicious and special food as he wined and dined and entertained the powerful people of his realm. Of course, the people who weren't there at the king's banquet are the people who were there for this sign of Jesus, this feeding. These were the ordinary people, the people with no great power, no great anything, but the vast majority of the people. In Hebrew, they were known as the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. These were the ignored people. These were the overlooked people. These were the, who cares people. They didn't have money. They didn't have power. They didn't really have anything to offer. Why would we try to heal their sick? There'll just be more of them. Why would we try to feed them or anything? As long as they do their work, they can feed themselves. Who cares? I mean, that's kind of the way that the rich and mighty and powerful dealt with them. And Jesus was tremendously attractive because he did care and because he was doing something about it. So now we have this story. Jesus is going to feed them. He's going to have a banquet. This banquet in the middle of nowhere on the grass, not in the great palace. And what are the people going to have in their great banquet? Just plain, old, everyday, ordinary food. Barley loaves and fish. But out of this little amount, with this ordinary stuff and these ordinary people, Jesus makes the extraordinary happen. He feeds them all. So much so that there are 12 baskets of bread fragments left over when they're done. 12 being an important number. He's saying, in a way, with me there's enough for everybody. No one is left out. No one's ignored. Enough for everybody. And Jesus fed them, all of those ordinary people, with all of that ordinary food, so that everybody shared. Now, we rightly look at this story as a foretaste of the Eucharist, what we are doing here today. All four gospel writers intended us to see that. In the story, Jesus does the same actions that he does at the Last Supper and that we do every single time we celebrate the Eucharist. He took the bread, he blessed the bread, he broke the bread, and he shared the bread. That's what we do every time. Take, bless, break, give. You know, the Eucharist used to be a full meal. This is one of the things that we often miss because it's been not a full meal for so long. But originally it was a full meal. When people brought to the church on Sunday bread and wine and other food to eat, and then it was all offered up, and it was blessed by the priest, and then it was broken and it was shared among the congregation. That's how it was supposed to work. If you read 2 Corinthians, when Paul excoriates them for how they're doing the Eucharist, it's because they quit sharing. That some people would bring a ton of food and they'd eat it all themselves, and they'd bring, a wineskin or three and get rip-roaring drunk, and other people would have nothing to eat. And that's when he talked about receiving the Eucharist unworthily because they weren't discerning that this was in fact Christ among them in real form, and that Christ among everybody is with everything being shared, and that no one is being left out. The Eucharist is and always has been that expression of the universality of Christ's love for everyone. But one thing I think we also need to not overlook is the ordinariness of the food. Now, people who've known me for a long time, and I've now been ordained for 28 years, will know that I don't actually like communion wafers. I never have. When I was newly ordained, I set out on a campaign to get rid of them. I lost. I don't fight that fight anymore. But I will still tell you I don't like communion wafers because they're not ordinary. In fact, most people don't even recognize them as food. They're not broken. They're perfectly round. They look wonderful, often have a special imprint on them. And I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to who say, oh, I really like that. It's because it's so special. It's not like ordinary bread. It's so pretty, and it's got the thing, the cross or the sheep or whatever they put on it. And I know it's special that I'm receiving it. It's not just some everyday thing. And I can understand that. We want our religious experiences to be special. We want them actually to be spectacular. But in point of fact, what we learn from the Eucharist and from times like what Jesus was doing out there in the middle of nowhere on the grass is it's in the very ordinariness of everyday life with each other that we most encounter God, that we most encounter Christ in our lives. In the ordinary everyday. Another of my professors in seminary, a systematic theology professor, Bob Hughes, used to say, don't go looking for Jesus in the Eggs Benedict if you haven't been able to find him in the cornflakes. It's because it's actually in the ordinariness of our lives that he's most present. I've attended a number of people's deaths, not enough to have done a great study, but on the other hand, they did a study in a hospice in England some time back, a big study, asking people as their death was approaching, what was it, did they have regrets, what was it that they would have liked to have done more of in life or had more of? And the answer was never money, power, spectacular vacations, etc. It always got back to, I wish I could have spent more time with the people I love doing the ordinary things we always did together. It is in that which is the real crux of life every day. That's where we find it. That's where our true meaning is found. That's where God is present. I just on the drive up today heard on the radio a woman who's written a book and talked about how she lost her faith, and she has a character in the book loses his faith. And in both cases, it's this expectation that if I'm praying to God and God's going to be active in my life, something big is going to happen. God's going to talk to me. The skies are going to open, etc. I know very few people who have experiences like that. But almost everybody, when they look back on their lives, realizes they've had an experience of God in the just very ordinary presence, when we're being human, when we're being relating to each other and loving each other and caring for each other. Yes, I prefer using ordinary bread in the Eucharist, because in its ordinariness and its brokenness, just as Jesus lived an ordinary life and was broken in his death, in that is also life. In that is also our salvation. And just as he has been raised from the dead, we too will be. And that reminder is there. In all of its ordinariness, the extraordinary love of God can be found and will be found. Look for Jesus in the plain bread of the day, in the cornflakes, when you're taking out the garbage, when you're cleaning the house, when you're doing the things that oh gosh, again, he's there. He always will be. Amen.